is what we call a theoretical model of the mind. We call it theory of mind. And so I'd like you to take notes, and because this is a very, very important foundational model of how the mind functions and how the work we do integrates into that model, okay? So, I was hoping for a better circle. That's more egg-like, but sometimes I do a pretty good job. So with theory of mind, let's just think of this semicircle as somebody's mind. Does it look like someone's mind to you? Hello? If we look at this and just imagine this is our mind, there is one of the processes through which we learn is what we call identification, association, and then we often create a response to that, okay? So let's think about in life how this applies. An example would be something like you might hear a specific song on the radio. What happens sometimes when you hear a song? What does it do inside?
Go right back to where you were, who you were with. You can remember in detail.
Right. So you hear a certain song. I was just at dinner yesterday. A student happened to come in where I was eating, and we had a chat, and she said, I was so excited. I was driving here, and this certain song came on, and she was talking about how it lifted her spirits and how she got all excited because of the song. And this kind of thing can happen. We identify that song. We associate it, as you were saying, with a certain moment in our life or something of that nature, and then we have a certain response. Sometimes it's an emotional response, something of that nature. Of course, that happens with our other senses as well, correct? It could be something like a smell, as an example. I mean, just to give you a little personal anecdote here, I guess, my mom wore this specific cologne that was called Ginate. Very, very unique scent. I don't think it was too expensive. Anyway, but, to this day, if I smell that, it's like identify this cologne, associate, Mom. And my response is I think of her, and I have a warm feeling, and it reminds me of when I was a kid. Or the smell of fresh cut grass. Does that bring up a memory for you? For me, that's a really strong one. I remember where I grew up and the first time I smelled that. So this is an obvious process through which we can associate so many of our senses. So when we're born, if we think of this as our mind again, there's part of the mind that is already wired and functioning. And we're going to call that the primitive area. And in this primitive area, there's a couple of responses we're going to look at, and ones that I'm sure most of you are well aware of, either having experienced them, I'm sure yourselves, but also probably studied them at one point or another. And this is what we call the fight-flight. Now, these are just a couple of the responses that are here, but fight-flight, of course, is one of these primitive kind of survival mechanisms that we're born with. And if we feel like we are being threatened, then we're either going to try to fight it and survive, or obviously flight or run and survive. And in a more primitive environment, if we were to imagine ourselves, let's say, as cavemen or something, if we were out and we came across a saber-toothed tiger and we had the right tool or whatever, or weapon, we might fight it and maybe have dinner, or flight so that we do not become dinner, this kind of thing. So a basic survival mechanism. We're also born with a couple of fears, and then we begin to associate, as we talked about before, and learn about the world around us through our experience. And so we're going to have some positive experiences, neutral experiences, negative experiences, that for each of us is going to make up how we interact with the world around us. So just simple example. Growing up, I was the kind of kid that kind of pushed my parents to have animals. And so I had the dog, the cat, the turtle, I had the fish. I kept most of them alive a long time too, so that's pretty good. But so growing up, I created a very positive relationship with animals, and let's say dogs as an example. But let's say that Stanley here, maybe growing up, maybe he was bitten by a dog, And so if my dog came running in here right now, I would be likely to act like a 10-year-old and want to play with her. But of course, Stanley would activate that fight-flight response because for him, he's associated a threat to this. Now, I know this is very simple, but we're building from here and coming up, okay? So the point is different people in the same world, given the same stimulus, can react very differently based on what we've learned, right? Okay. So these things are what we call our knowns. What becomes known to us. And these knowns, again, when we identify a situation, associate to it, and respond, they really become very subconscious in nature. I mean, if we go back to Stanley again and this example of him being afraid of a dog, does he see a dog approach and say to himself consciously, I recognize there's a dog approaching, I'd like to activate my fight-flight? That's not what happens, right? I know I'm being silly, but the reality is after a while it becomes very much this kind of automatic response. So, same thing with the positive response. That's just how we react in these situations. So if we look at this primitive area and these knowns and these memories, these associations, all of these kind of autonomic or automatic responses that go on in the body and in the mind, we look at this as all unconscious or subconscious in nature. And so we estimate that's about 88% of the mind. Now, when we reach about 8 or 9 years of age, approximately, we begin to create, we're going to call this the critical mind. And it's part of the consciousness and part in the unconscious mind. And this critical mind, we think of this as a kind of filter of sorts. Critical thinking. When we're younger in age and we don't have the organic brain development, we don't have the life experience, then we don't have the ability to really analyze and think about and decide what is correct or not correct because we literally haven't, we haven't matured enough to do that. But at a certain point, somewhere around 8 or 9 years of age, we're beginning to be able to really use this idea of critically analyzing, just as you guys are doing here tonight. You're thinking about the information, analyzing it, deciding if it makes sense to you or not. And so the conscious critical thinking, we've got logic, and we've got reason, and we've got decision, and our will, or our willpower. And so this part of the mind, this conscious critical thinking, is there to try to protect us, or so that we can think about, analyze. When we imagine a young child that doesn't have this facility, and if you're the adult, you're the parent, and you say something to them, do they have the ability to think about and analyze, and is that logical, and does that make sense? They're much more receptive and open. They just accept it at face value, don't they? Until the ability is developed both through brain development and experience and learning about life. And so we have this critical facility that becomes available to us. And so we're looking at this as about that other 12%. What's important is that we understand how these two can interact and why, at times, this can lead someone to come to see us in the work we do, or other therapists. So
12% includes critical mind?
12% is the conscious, which includes part of the critical mind, and 88% is the unconscious with the other basically half of this critical mind. We're going to get into a little more of that in our next class in terms of the detail. So let's look at some examples of how this interaction can occur. And I'll just pick out names and pick on people, so hopefully you're okay with that. Nathan. So let's say Nathan, and who can I pick on? Roberto? Okay. So let's say they're in class together, and one day they're coming into class, and they decide, let's get together for dinner before class. And Nathan's been on this health kick. And so he's been eating well, getting rid of the refined carbohydrates and the excess fat and all of this, and he's feeling good, working out. And so they get together, and what does he order? Maybe grilled chicken salad with the dressing on the side, hold the bread, something like that, right? And feeling good about what he ordered. And so what does Roberto order? Cheeseburger, fries, double-sized Coke, or 64-ounce Coke or something. And here comes the food, but Nathan's good with that, and Roberto's good with that, and they're going ahead and they're eating. And they finish their meal, and I'm sure he looked at some of that stuff on his plate and went, "Oh, it looks pretty good, but I'm feeling good." And so he's, logic, reasoning. I know what I'm doing. This is good for me. I'm going to eat well and continue to be healthy. But then the unimaginable thing happens. And here comes the server. And what is the server bringing?
Dessert.
Uh-oh. It's a dessert tray. And so let's say that growing up, Nathan, at every birthday, let's say, his mom gave him, how about chocolate cake? Okay? Chocolate cake. And when that dessert tray comes over, guess what is sitting right next to him when it sits right next to his face? There's this double thick, triple layer chocolate cake from hell, and it's right next to him, and now he starts to smell it, identify, associate, respond, It's starting to crack a little bit. And then, of course, what he's getting is the big smile inside, and now the salivation starts, and he's trying to hold out. No, I don't eat that stuff. I'm getting healthy, all that. And next thing you know, what happens?
He's eating.
Next thing you know, he's got his napkin wiping chocolate off his face because he just ate a whole big piece of that, right? So what happens there? What happens?
Subconscious went out.
In essence, I guess, yeah, that's right. The subconscious wins out because this strong, powerful part of his mind that has this strong relationship that was established a long time ago and has such a pleasure association to it is saying, eat chocolate. I don't believe chocolate's good for me. Eat chocolate, And it is this conflict between the two that occurs. And, sometimes he can do it, but what put him over the edge is that proverbial straw that broke the camel's back was this chocolate cake that he associated to him, and there now the next time they go to dinner, he's eating the hamburgers and everything because it's right. So if we think about that idea, what are some other things that can occur like that we see in our lives or in people we know their lives, where this kind of conflict occurs? Yes. Alcoholism, that's a good example. At a certain point, the person doesn't want to drink anymore consciously. Their logic tells them not to, right? But what happens? Now here, of course, we have some biochemistry involved too. It's not just psychological, but there certainly is that psychological component. What's something else? Smoking's a big one. Of course, that's one we deal with often because there is such a strong psychological relationship to the addiction of smoking. So let's look at smoking for a minute. Think about smoking. Anyone who's smoked will tell you, I've never met a single person, I've worked with literally hundreds of smokers, but there is really no one I've ever talked to who said that first cigarette they smoked, they went, "Oh, that is good. Ooh, love that thing," right? Your body's telling you, don't put this in me. You're coughing, you're getting nauseated, or you'll have some response like that, right? But when you're maybe in your late teens, when a lot of people start smoking and your friends are smoking, you push through that. And of course, we're a very adaptive species, and after a while, your body goes, okay, so we'll shut down that response because I guess we're going to have this stuff around all the time. And then both the unconscious learn, or the subconscious learns to associate this connection to, let's say, after a meal, I want to reach for a cigarette, or when I'm stressed, eventually this kind of relationship becomes established. And so in the beginning, let's say into the early 20s or so at least, they wanted to smoke and they're smoking, right? And they've learned to smoke, and so they've associated the motivations, these associations that are driving that behavior, right? And so that conflict doesn't exist then, does it? Because they want to do it consciously, and subconsciously they're being motivated to do it. There is no conflict there yet. What happens? When does the conflict occur? And why does that happen? Maybe they get older and they decide, you know what, this doesn't taste so good anymore. I'm afraid it's taking away my youthful appearance. I feel like a social pariah. I'm coughing a lot. I'm tied down to this ball and chain. And these days, the cost is, it's becoming exorbitant to smoke, isn't it? So all these elements come into it, and at a certain point, they say to themselves, I don't want to do this anymore. But now the conflict has occurred, because just because they consciously don't want to do it, does it change this? Well, over time, maybe, over a long period of time, but initially that conflict is certainly there, and people struggle with that. And most of us don't know this information. They just think, well, if I want to stop, I should just be able to stop. And then they beat themselves up, and they create these, they stress themselves out over it, and the stress leads them wanting to do it more. And you can get into these cycles, right? So that's our job. Because our job is to help people to change some of these learned associative relationships that don't work in their life anymore. And so we help people to change these relationships when they become established. It's one of the very important things that we do in this work. So we talked about the eating and the chocolate cake. I remember a case that my mentor in this program years ago told me about a young woman who came in who was in a relationship, and she kept sabotaging it. This is another thing that can happen. She couldn't figure out why, because consciously, her logic, her reasoning said, this is a good guy. He's nice to me, he's good to me, but these behaviors keep coming up. And what she uncovered was the fact that this guy in her life was an actor. And in her family growing up, her father was an actor, and her mother used to always say to her over and over again when they get in a fight, whatever you do, don't ever marry an actor. And so this kind of conditioning and this negative actor. And so every time they get closer and closer, this motivation would come up, and this internal sabotage would happen. And so this is another, it can happen in relationships and things like cigarettes. It can happen in so many different areas of our life that these conflicts can occur. So we help people to resolve those conflicts, okay? Any questions about that? Pretty straightforward, huh? Okay. So, in our daily lives, we have a lot of information that we process. And we're going to call this processing of information message units. Message units. And we're going to focus on four elements that relate to these message units. And one would be the environment. So I'm just going to put E and V for the environment. Our body. Our conscious thinking, and our subconscious. Environment, body, consciousness, and subconscious. So what can happen with these message units is that we feel like that the critical mind is kind of like this cup that I've been drinking out of, in that it has a certain capacity. And let's just say that capacity was 1,000 message units. And the idea is that when we start to process a lot of information, there's a point in which we can become overloaded. You know, it's like filling the cup up, and if right at the top, if I put one more drop in there, it doesn't go in the cup anymore, and it just goes on the outside, right? And so when we have this overload that occurs, this critical filter begins to break down because it can't filter anymore. Trying to stuff too much through the filter, and it's not there. Now, you know, I'm sure probably everyone in here at one point or another, and probably it's a fairly common thing, is you'll say, I'm feeling overloaded, or you know, certainly you've experienced that sensation, right? It might have been a difficult day at the office, and you go home and something's not working, or just the stress of day-to-day kind of building up issues with sleep, things of this nature. And at a certain point, we just can't process anymore. And so let's look at an example of something like that that can happen. Let's say that I have a client coming in at 9 o'clock in the morning. And so I have to get up at about 8:30, about 7 o'clock or so to get in here. And I forget to set my alarm. And so I wake up, and I've got a client at 9, and the clock says, 8. What's going to happen right in that moment when I see that clock?
Very late.
Yes. First thing is, uh-oh, right? So first thing is I see that number, and my conscious thinking starts going, uh-oh, I'm going to be late, right? And I start to worry. Message units flooding in, right? And it's cold outside, and so as I get out of my bed, that cold air hits me, and there's messages through there, and then I kick my dog's toy, and it stubs my toe, and now I'm hopping. And so now I have more message units, and all the while my subconscious is probably trying to get me to the coffee pot or the bathroom or something, right? And I go and get in the car, and it's a bad traffic day, and I'm going to be late, and I'm worrying, and it's cold, and my heater's not working, and all these things are going on as an example. 1 second, I'll get your question. And we can reach a point at which all of a sudden I'm driving to work, but I'm not really aware I'm even driving to work. Anyone ever experienced that? Yeah, it's like, well, how did I get here? What happened? Yes, you had a question.
I was going to ask, at that moment of the when you made a decision that it's going to be a bad day, can you also say, you know what, it's going to be a tight schedule, but I can do it?
Sure.
Operate from that point?
Sure.
Is
And
that a possibility?
oh, yeah, sure. You could have a positive or negative, optimistic outlook or pessimistic one, certainly. But in either case, it's still processing information. It's like we talk about stress. Stress can be good or bad, but it's still a lot to deal with, You're buying a house, and it's a wonderful thing, but going through that process is usually not fun, right? So whether it's a positive way you frame it or a negative one, still you're dealing with thoughts, ideas, information. And we'll just look at those, whether they're good or bad, or positive or negative, optimistic, pessimistic, is messaging. It's just more information we have to deal with. So we can get to a point at which we can overload this critical thinking. And now the filter's not operating well, if at all. And so in essence, it's kind of like we've opened up this filter. And if we remember what we talked about earlier about a child that grows up early on and doesn't have the filter, they're very open, very receptive, aren't they? Because they don't have that ability. And when our filter breaks down, then we're not filtering anymore either. And there is more of an openness. And so the negative ideas I have, or positive ones, now are being more readily accepted into the unconscious without this filtering process to look at it, analyze it, decide if it's going to accept it, vent it, either way, right? So, we have this overload of message units that leads to the breakdown of this critical filter. And when the breakdown of the critical filter happens, it triggers a fight-flight response because now our critical filtering is breaking down, and it triggers fight-flight. And we become what is commonly referred to as hyper-suggestible. Very suggestible, right? Now, how often does something like this happen in our daily lives? It can happen a lot. But, you know, if we're not aware of it, because it's just what we have to deal with in life, then we're walking around how?
Hypnotized.
An automaton. No. Yeah, you're in a hypersuggestible state, or as you say, hypnotized. Yeah. Question.
So is that why they put billboards on the freeway? Because everyone's so overloaded that then you're like, wow, if I drink beer, women will really think I'm cute.
That's not true.
I mean, because that makes sense to me. Then you're like,
Well, you know, if we really get down to the nitty-gritty here, of course, all advertising is about suggestibility and about making people suggestible to whatever the product is through various means. And certainly in our society, I mean, all we have to do is look at the U.S. And statistically, we work the most hours. We often sleep the least hours. We take the least amount of vacation. And so basically we're what? We're just stressed out and overloaded a lot of the time. That's a reality of what many of us are experiencing. And so, you know, with all the other things going on in our world at different times, there's always lots of things that are potentially creating this kind of overload within us. You know, so if we think about, I talked about the idea of driving to work, but I'm sure many of you can relate with the idea of driving home from work is more common. You know, you've gone through your whole day and you've dealt with all this stuff, and now you're driving home, and you don't remember the drive. I mean, there's times when you'll be driving and you miss a turnoff, right? And how did I get here? I mean, and so your mind was off somewhere else, and you were just driving. You wonder who's driving the car, don't you? I hope my subconscious is a real good driver. So far, it's been pretty good, but you know. But understanding this also gives you the ability to understand when it's happening to you and also take charge of it more. And you can learn how to be less overloaded, quote unquote, or when you are, what to do to become more in a more aware, conscious state. And these are some of the empowering tools that you'll learn not only for yourself, but also, of course, for your clients. And again, in our society, these tools are very valuable tools for people. We often see people who we have to dehypnotize before we can do anything else with them. You know, when we go to a movie theater, as an example, my brother's a film director, so we talk about being in the same business all the time, except he gets paid a lot more than me. But you know, why does he make a film? He produces a film to entertain people, and so that when they go and sit in a movie theater, they can become suggestible to that information, and that they can have these responses that are about entertainment, right? Because if you think about it, if we think about a theater and we go and sit down like you are amongst a bunch of people, after a while, if it's a good film, you don't think about the people around you, do you? They kind of go away, and you get sucked into this. And why do you think it's a huge screen and really bright and the music's really loud? Right? They're overloading you. What did they used to do in movie theaters? They would put in these little ads in there, wouldn't they? Like they cut one frame in of a Coke can or something, you know, and it was so fast that you couldn't consciously pick it up, but subconsciously, you would, and their sales of Coke would go up. And they're not allowed to do that anymore. At least we don't think so. But these are the kinds of things that go on in a theater. We get swept up in a film, and we know they're actors. We know it's not real, but do you get scared sometimes? Yes. Why? Because you allow yourself to do that, right? You allow yourself to become suggestible to that information. We laugh, we cry, we have these experiences. So, you know, earlier when we were here, I asked you guys how many people had been hypnotized before and what should have happened. Everyone's hand should have gone up, right? This is a natural state. It's a state we are going to, we're going to experience in life. We learn how to use this as a means of creating change in these conflicts that can occur between the consciousness and the unconscious. And there's some other things we also do with this, but that's a real primary application of these tools. And so it's really not so much about can I be hypnotized or not, because again, we experience that in our lives very commonly. Question about that? Yes?
Could you define the role of the critical mind again?
Think of the critical mind like a filter. Okay, so whatever's coming in, whatever you're like right now, you're listening to me, you're looking at the diagrams I'm drawing, and you're analyzing it. Does this make sense? Is it logical? Can't read logic anymore, but is it logical? Is this reasonable? You're deciding whether you're going to accept this information or not. And if you don't, you're not going to accept it, right? When we don't have that capability anymore, and then that information's coming in and you are overloaded, then you're less able to analyze and filter, and in a sense, we call it kind of a protective mechanism that we learn in life. And so when we become overloaded or go into, as we've talked about, hypersuggestibility or hypnosis, we open up this pathway into the unconscious where this critical thinking doesn't distort or diminish the idea, or accept it or not. It is allowed to pass. Okay? So, when we think about this definition, one second, when we think about this definition of how hypnosis is being created here in this situation, and how we are going to learn to create it in our hypnosis work we do as well, I want you to write this down, that hypnosis is created by an overload of message units. There's 5 elements to this. So it's overload of message units. It disorganizes the inhibitory process. So it's an overload of message units, disorganizing the inhibitory process or the critical mind. Inhibitory process and critical mind are the same thing. Overload of message units, disorganizing the inhibitory process, which triggers fight, flight, leading to hypersuggestibility and access to the subconscious mind. This is a definition of how hypnosis is being created. And as we go through these classes together, we're going to talk about how that occurs in our work as well, and how we can use it as a very effective tool to create this suggestible state.